We want to take you now to Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida, where President Trump is speaking.
It's important to state that incredible things are happening in our country. I think we've made more progress in 3 weeks than they've made in 4 years, especially with respect to the reputation of our country. And people are respecting us again as a country and as a powerful country, and maybe a smart country, but maybe not so smart, because when you look at some of the waste, fraud, and abuse that's being uncovered by DOGE and the people at DOGE, these are young, often young, but super brilliant people, incredible computer scientists and other things, and they're finding levels of fraud and waste and abuse like I think nobody ever thought possible. But before we do that, I just want to ask Will to come over. I've just finished signing some executive orders, and if we could start with that, Will, you might want to come up here and just explain what we did. Thank you.
Good afternoon, y'all. A short while ago, President Trump signed three items. The first is an executive order relating to the affordability and availability of in vitro fertilization and other fertility treatments. These are treatments that have become unaffordable for many Americans, or have been unaffordable for many Americans. And the executive order is a directive to the Domestic Policy Council to examine ways to make IVF and other fertility treatments more affordable for more Americans. The second item that we signed was a presidential memorandum imposing radical transparency requirements on government departments and agencies, in keeping with President Trump and the administration's broader commitment to governmental transparency. What this presidential memorandum would do is require, as waste, fraud, and abuse is uncovered, as programs are canceled, and ultimately as taxpayer dollars are saved, this presidential memorandum would require departments and agencies to make all of the details of that freely available to the public. Lastly, we have another executive order that President Trump signed relating to independent agencies. This executive order would establish important oversight functions in the Office of Management and Budget and its subsidiary office, OIRA, supervising independent agencies and many of their actions, and also reestablishes the longstanding norm that only the President or the Attorney General can speak for the United States when stating an opinion as to what the law is.
Thank you very much, Will. That was the primary purpose of this conference, to explain that they're all very important in their own way. Fertilization, I've been saying that we're going to do what we have to do, and I think the women and families, husbands, are very appreciative of it. But that was it. I do want to say while I'm up here, I've been contacted by some of the biggest companies in the world, and because of what we're doing economically and through tariffs and taxes and incentives, they want to come back into the United States. And we'll be announcing various very large companies, the biggest actually, and they'll be coming back, having to do with chips and having to do also with cars and lots of other things. We're going to be announcing some very, very big, momentous, I think momentous decisions are being made by companies all around the world, the biggest, and they want to come back into the U.S. Car plants are being canceled in other locations now because they want to build them here. And you read about a couple, not that I want to mention names or anything, but you read about a couple of big ones in Mexico just got canceled because they're going to be building them in the United States. And that's very simply because of what we're doing with respect to taxes, tariffs, and incentives. And I think it's a very important thing. And you'll be seeing this over the next probably over the next 2 years, to be honest, but you're going to see a lot of it over the next couple of weeks. A lot of big ones are going to be announcing. And so while we're here, I guess we can take a couple of quick questions. Go ahead, please. Please.
Mr. President, have you decided specifically what the auto tariff rate should be?
Yeah, I probably will tell you that on April 2nd, but it'll be in the neighborhood of 25%.
And pharmaceuticals?
It'll be 25% and higher, and it'll go very substantially higher over a course of a year. But we want to give them time to come in because, as you know, when they come into the United States and they have their plant or factory here, there is no tariff. So we want to give them a little bit of a chance. Yes, thank you.
The
Andrea Shalal, the EU representative is going to be here in Washington tomorrow. He's going to be meeting with Hassett and Greer and Letnick. What can the EU do to sort of avoid the reciprocal tariffs that you've talked about? And, you've talked a lot about the VAT. Do you expect them to reduce that?
Well, they did already, as I understand it, reduce their car tariff all the way down to what we have. And a lot of that will take place, and I think some won't do it and some will do it. But the EU had a 10% tax on cars, and now they have a 2.5% tax, which is the exact same as us. So already we've saved a tremendous amount. That would be great. If everybody would do that, then we'd all be on the same playing field. Because essentially what we're doing with the tariffs is, they charge us, we charge them, same amount. And it's called reciprocal, actually. And whatever they charge us, we're charging them. And so the EU is, I appreciate that they did this, but, the EU has been very unfair to us. We have a deficit of $350 billion. They don't take our cars. They don't take our farm products. They don't take almost anything. They take very little. And we're going to have to straighten that out. And we will. I have no doubt about it. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Russia talks, your impression of how they went today, and if you're perhaps more confident or less confident of a deal after what happened today?
Well, much more confident. They were very good. Russia wants to do something. They want to stop the savage barbarianism. I mean, what's going on over there? It's soldiers are being killed by the thousands on a weekly basis. It's ridiculous. And they're not American soldiers. They're Russian soldiers, and they're Ukrainian soldiers largely, although a lot of Koreans have been killed, as you know. Quite a bit of them have been killed. They came over to fight, and a large portion have been wiped out. But we want to end it. It's a senseless war. It should have never happened, would have never happened if I was president, and it's a shame to see it. And I see pictures that you don't see, but I see pictures of fields that look just horrible. It looks like Gettysburg. If you see the old pictures of Gettysburg, it's soldiers lying all over the field, body parts all over the field. They're all dead. And this is going on a daily basis. It's a horrible thing. Both Russia and Ukraine, they're losing thousands and thousands of soldiers, and a lot of people have been killed, too. I think that's one of the things that you'll see historically, and you'll see later on as it goes along. I think people are going to be surprised at how many people, not only soldiers, have been killed in Ukraine. A lot more people than you think. Yeah, please.
President Trump, as part of a peace deal with Putin, would you be willing to consider removing all American troops from Europe?
Well, nobody's asked me to do that, so I don't think we'd have to do that. I wouldn't want to do that. But that question's never really come up. Yeah. Please.
Sir, do you support stationing European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine as part of this peace deal?
If they want to do that, that's great. I'm all for it. If they want to do that, I think that'd be fine.
Even if the Russians are...
I mean, I know France has mentioned it. Others have mentioned it. UK has mentioned it. But, if we have a peace deal, I think having troops over there from the standpoint of Europe, we won't have to put any over there because, we're very far away. But having troops over there would be fine. I would not object to it at all. We're talking about this now, peace. We have either a ceasefire or a peace itself, and we're looking to do both. We'd start off with the ceasefire, and if they want to do that. I know France was willing to do that, and I thought that was a beautiful gesture. Yeah, please.
Do you have any message for Ukrainians who, after 3 years of fighting, might feel betrayed or disappointed at not having a seat at these initial talks in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think I'm really disappointed in what's happened. I've been watching this for 3 years. It's a war that would have never happened if I was president, and I've been watching these people being killed at levels that you've rarely seen, not even close, since the Second World War. And I'm very disappointed. I hear that, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their sides. You have those magnificent golden domes. that are shattered will never be replaced. You can't replace them. 1,000-year-old domes that are so beautiful, you can't replace that. A whole civilization has changed because of what. So when they're worried about not being seated, you mean somebody that should have gone in and made a deal a long time ago. You could have made a deal. This is one that could have made a deal. There was no talk of this during the Trump administration. Putin would have never, ever done it. And by the way, we wouldn't have had October 7th. You know that. We wouldn't have had October 7th either in Israel. And we wouldn't have had that mess that's going on over there. It's like we have great fire people here. We're putting out fires. All over the world, we're putting out fires. So that wouldn't have happened. And you know what else wouldn't have happened? Inflation. Because it was caused really by the cost of energy going through the roof because of their bad energy policies and also their spending, their terrible spending, wasteful spending on the Green New scam. It's a scam. It's a whole big scam. Yeah, please.
Yes, sir. I want to ask you a little closer to home. What would it take for you to reconsider the restrictions on the Associated Press? And secondly, some of your advisors are concerned with the Associated Press's style guide, using language and giving guidance to not use words like illegal immigrant or to use phrases like gender-affirming care. And they're concerned about that being an encroaching amount of liberalism in the way in which the press writes about things. Do you share those concerns?
Well, I do think that some of the phrases that they want to use are ridiculous, and I think, frankly, they become obsolete, especially in the last 3 weeks, because many things have happened in the last 3 weeks. And I didn't know about that, but I would say that if they want to use certain phrases like that, and I guess some are okay, but many aren't, but the Associated Press just refuses to go with what the law is and what is taking place. It's called the Gulf of America now. It's not called the Gulf of Mexico any longer. I have the right to do it, just like we have the right to do Mount McKinley, and nobody's even challenging that. But only the essentially, it's primarily the Associated Press, and I don't know what they're doing, but I just say that we're going to keep them out until such time as they agree that it's the Gulf of America. We're very proud of this country, and we want it to be the Gulf of America. Now, the Associated Press, as you know, has been very, very wrong on the election, on Trump and the treatment of Trump, and other things having to do with Trump and Republicans and conservatives. And they're doing us no favors, and I guess I'm not doing them any favors. That's the way life works. But, you know, thank you for the question. Who are you with? Very good question. Thank you. Yes.
We're hearing that Russia wants to force Ukraine to hold new elections in order to sign any kind of a peace deal. Is that something that the U.S. would ever support?
Well, we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating, and where a country has been blown to smithereens. You got most of the cities are laying on their sides. The buildings are collapsed. It looks like a massive demolition site. The whole, I mean, so many of the cities. I mean, they haven't done it in Kiev because I guess they don't want to shoot too many rockets in there. They've done it 20%, but they haven't done it 100%. If they wanted to do it 100%, it would probably happen very quickly. But you have cities that are absolutely decimated. And yeah, I would say that, you know, when they want a seat at the table, you could say the people have to, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, you know, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also. You know, Ukraine is being just wiped out. Look at what's happening to the cities. There are cities, there's not even a building standing. It's a massive, you talk about Gaza. I mean, it's literally, these cities look like Gaza. Actually, many have, percentage-wise, more buildings knocked down than in Gaza. So, you know, people are tired of it. People want to see something happen. And, you know, the other thing that it's been bothering me for a long time, because I solved the problem with NATO. They paid hundreds of billions of dollars into the funds of NATO when I said you got to pay, because the United States was paying for European countries, and then they take advantage of us on trade. But I've seen it. Look, they have to pay. They have to find out, where's the money going to? We have, I believe President Zelensky said last week that he doesn't know where half of the money is that we gave him. Well, We gave them, I believe, $350 billion, but let's say it's something less than that, but it's a lot. And we have to equalize with Europe because Europe has given us given a very much smaller percentage than that. I think Europe has given $100 billion, and we've given, let's say, 300 plus. And it's more important for them than it is for us. We have an ocean in between, and they don't. But where is all the money that's been given? Where is it going? And nobody, I've never seen an accounting of it. We give hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't see any accounting. So I want to see peace. Look, you know why I want? Because I don't want all these people killed anymore. I'm looking at people that are being killed, and they're Russian and Ukrainian people, but they're people. Doesn't matter where they're from on the whole planet. And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue. What he was so bad for this. It was so bad, so pathetic, so sad. But with all of that being said, look, it is what it is. When I left, there was no chance that this could have happened. But it happened because we had incompetent leadership at many different levels. But when you see what's taken place in Ukraine with millions of people killed, including the soldiers, millions of people killed, a big percentage of their cities knocked down to the ground. I don't know how anybody even lives there. You know, when they say they took a poll and Zelensky's at 4%, who's living there? You know, I mean, it's hard to believe that people live there. Their cities are being knocked down, and this is something that would have never happened. And by the way, for 4 years, it didn't happen. It was never going to happen. Go ahead.
How would you counter the perception, because Russia's pushing for this, obviously, they don't really hold true elections, that would be a capitulation of some sort? How would you guard against potentially Russia installing a puppet government? And then finally, how would that new election have an impact on getting Zelensky to sign the rare earth minerals deal?
Look, you have leadership, and I like him personally. He's fine. But I don't care about personally. I care about getting the job done. You have leadership now that's allowed a war to go on that should have never even happened, even without the United States. Look, we had a president who was grossly incompetent. He had no idea what he was doing. He said some very stupid things, like going in for portions and all of the things. He made a lot of bad statements, but he's grossly incompetent, and I think everyone knew that. This is something that should have never happened, would have never happened. And I used to discuss it with Putin. President Putin and I would talk about Ukraine, and it was the apple of his eye, I will tell you that. But there was never a chance of him going in. And I told him, you better not go in, don't go in, don't go in. And he understood that. He understood it fully. But I'm only interested, I want to see if I can save maybe millions of lives. This could even end up in a World War III. I mean, to be honest with you, you've been hearing now Europe is saying, well, I think we're going to go in and we're going to go. All of a sudden, you're going to end up in World War III over something that should have never happened. And, you know, it's a very sad situation. Yeah, please.
In a court filing, the White House said that Elon Musk is not a DOGE employee and has no authority to make decisions. Can you clarify for us today
well, Elon
what his
Musk,
exact role is there?
Yeah. Elon is, to me, a patriot. So, you know, you could call him an employee, you could call him a consultant, you could call him whatever you want. But he's a patriot. I mean, look at the kind of things. I just said, just write it down, just in case that question got asked, right? And which I'm surprised it took so long, actually. But you know what? Ukraine's a bigger deal because people are dying by the thousands a week, thousands. But look at this, from 90 to 99, Social Security, 6,054,000 people. Well, that's okay. Maybe that's possible. You know, 90 to 99, maybe it's possible. It's a lot of people, though, at that. But people that live to 100 to 109, 4,734,000. Wow, that's a lot. That means over 100 years old. They're 4 million people. I don't know too many. I know people that are doing great in their 90s, but not too many people over 100. But over 120, from 120 years old, people that are 120 years old up to 129. 3,472,000 people. Wow. You know that can't possibly be, because the record is like, I think it's one person, a woman, lived to 127, but they have 3,472. Okay, but now we're going really in. People from 130 years old to 139-year-old, 3,936,000. Wow. I wonder if people are getting paid with all this. I mean, are these checks? And that's what we're checking right now. People from 140 years old to 149 years old, 3,542,000, 140 years old and beyond. Now we're really going, because we're looking to break the record by 25 years. People from 150 years old to 159 years old, 1,345,000. These are in the, by the way, these are in the computer files. This is what they do well. They're super. I asked Elon, who are these DOGE people? He said they're super brilliant computer people and they love the country. It's simple. Wait a minute. People from 160 years old to 169 years, 121,000. So 160-year-old people. 170 to 179,000, 6,087. But now, let's go into the real numbers. From 200 to 209 years old, 879 people. From 210 years old, I haven't met any of them. And if I did, I would bless them. I would worship the ground they walk on. 210 to 219 years, 866. From 220 years old to 229 years old, 1,039. And then you have two people, from 240 years old to 249 years old, one person. And there's one person that's 360 years old. That's just that. And then, where's the money being spent, right? Let's go into that for just a second. $520 million for a consultant on the environment. It's called Environmental, Social, and Governance. Investments in Africa and mobilize private sector resources. $520 million. Somebody got $520 million for an environmental. Sounds like an environmental study. It's I've always been one that paid a lot of money for my environmental studies, but I paid like $50,000, not $520 million. $520 million for ESG. $25 million to promote biodiversity, conservation, and promote licit livelihoods by developing socially responsible behavior in the country of Colombia. Well, it's nice, $25 million to go into Colombia for something that nobody ever heard of. $40 million to improve the social and economic inclusion of sedentary migrants. $40 million. $42 million for Johns Hopkins, great place, to research and drive social and behavior change in Uganda. $42 million. What about us? What about social change in our country? $70 million for a center at Purdue to research university-sourced, evidence-based solutions to developmental challenges. I mean, these are massive numbers on things that nobody ever heard about. $10 million for Mozambique voluntary medical male circumcisions. $10 million for circumcisions in another country. $9.7 million for UC Berkeley to develop a cohort of Cambodian youth with enterprise-driven skills. In other words, let's teach them something about enterprise. What about our people? Can't we teach them about enterprise? $2.3 million for strengthening independent voices in Cambodia. $32 million to the Prague Civil Society Center, which is a very liberal group of people. Wonder how much of that money came back to the people that approved it. $14 million for improving public procurement in Serbia. $486 million to the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening, including $22 million for inclusive and participatory political process in Moldova. and $21 million for voter turnout in India. Well, why are we giving $21 million to India? They got a lot of money. They're one of the highest taxing countries in the world in terms of us. We can hardly get in there because their tariffs are so high. I have a lot of respect for India. I have a lot of respect for the Prime Minister. He just left, as you know, 2 days ago. But we're giving $21 million for voter turnout. It's voter turnout in India. What about, like, voter turnout here? Oh, we've done that, I guess. We did $500 million, didn't we? It's called the lockboxes. $20 million for fiscal federalism in Nepal. Listen to these numbers. This is all fraud. $19 million for biodiversity conservation in Nepal. $1.5 million for voter confidence. We want to give them confidence in Liberia. $14 million for social cohesion in Mali. $2.5 million for inclusive democracies in South Africa. $47 million for improving learning outcomes in Asia. Asia's doing very well. They're doing a lot better than we do in the schools, aren't they? $2 million to develop sustainable recycling models to increase socioeconomic cohesion among marginalized communities in Kosovo. And
hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in New York. We've been watching President Trump speak after signing two executive orders and one presidential memorandum this afternoon at Mar-a-Lago. One of them focused on expanding access to in vitro fertilization, and another advocating within the executive branch something called radical transparency for government agencies. Essentially, taking the work of the Department of Government Efficiency, putting it online so the public can see where savings might have been achieved, or at least potential savings identified. This within the Office of Management and Budget and other executive branch agencies. The president took several questions. Let me summarize the two biggest headline-grabbing issues raised. The president talked about his very fervent desire to establish peace between Russia and Ukraine. But any Ukrainian or European dissecting his remarks would hear no discouraging words for Russia or Vladimir Putin about precipitating this war, invading Ukraine, and implying several times that it was the fault of Ukraine for not settling this before the invasion occurred nearly 3 years ago. That will be deeply disturbing to those in Ukraine trying to deal with the Russian invasion in many different ways, and for Europeans continuing to support Ukraine and wondering about what the direction ultimately will be of peace talks that the Trump administration has set in motion with Russia. There was also a reference to elements of waste found by the Department of Government Efficiency, led at least in title, if not in exact executive branch terminology, by Elon Musk. The president made a reference, and I'm sure this will get digested across the country, of people receiving Social Security benefits who are 120 years old, 130 years old. That is, in all likelihood, not true. Why? Because we know that the underlying computer language model at Social Security Administration, something called COBOL, if anyone took computer science 40 years ago in college, you'd know that. It's an outdated system. It doesn't have precise dating mechanisms. And in 2023, the Inspector General at the Social Security Administration did a report that said 99% of those on the list who appear to be 120, 130 or something, other age larger than that, are not receiving any Social Security benefits at all, though it might appear that they are. Those are just two of the biggest things that came out of this press conference. We'll continue to monitor it, but I want to bring in CBS News Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is in West Palm Beach, to talk about other developments from this press conference. Nancy?
Major, the executive orders that President Trump announced and signed were all interesting for various reasons. Let's take the IVF one first. This was a campaign promise of his. After Roe v. Wade was struck down a couple of years ago, there was some thinking by Republicans that made them particularly vulnerable on the issue of IVF, because there were some conservatives arguing that now that states had the power to roll back abortion protections, that perhaps they could roll back IVF provisions as well, because they viewed it as akin to abortion. There were other Republicans who felt just the opposite, who said that no, IVF was a path to creating life. And so the way that President Trump dealt with this on the campaign trail was to first claim that he himself was actually the father of IVF, which raised some eyebrows, but then to say that once he was president, he was going to do something to lower the cost of IVF, which we know can rise into the tens of thousands, if not $100,000 per couple, which is something that most people can't afford. So the announcement he made today doesn't actually immediately lower the price of IVF because that can only be done with the help of insurance companies, but it essentially tasks the government with figuring out ways to make IVF and other fertility treatments less expensive. The transparency executive order, not that surprising. He's been talking a lot about transparency. Basically, it requires government agencies, as they're making these cuts, to announce what they're doing and why they're doing it. That would be welcome because up until now, we've had a lot of trouble getting information about, for example, how many jobs are being cut across agencies. But the third executive order was really interesting, Major, and I think a lawyer would need to tell us whether it's actually legal or not, because what it does is rein in independent agencies. For the layman, there are plenty of federal agencies that come under the direct purview of the President of the United States. Think of the Pentagon, the State Department, the Energy Department. He can name who heads those agencies. He can fire who heads those agencies. The chain of command goes all the way up to the top, and that's him. But there are a lot of agencies that are considered independent. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Election Commission. And while he has the power to name some of the commissioners, he doesn't have the power to fire them if they don't do what he wants. Think back, for example, to the Biden administration. He desperately wanted to get rid of the postmaster, Louis DeJoy, because he was somebody who had been put in place by Donald Trump in his first term. Biden didn't agree with DeJoy, but he could not remove him. And basically what this executive order calls for is placing these independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the FCC, the SEC, back under the purview of OMB and the President of the United States. And it's just not clear to me whether statute actually allows that. So it's possible that this could lead to yet another lawsuit like so many others that we've been watching unfold throughout the country.
And Nancy, I'm so glad you brought that third one up, because that question, what is the independence of these independent agencies, is being litigated in federal courts right now. And if the announcement that preceded President Trump coming to the microphones from one of his top White House officials saying that under this executive order, it asserts that only the president and the attorney general can state the consensus or policy of any independent agency. That's not the intent of Congress for the creation of those independent agencies, and it's not been the historical orientation to the federal courts about their status in relationship to the executive branch.
Exactly, and there's a reason that many of these agencies were created to be quasi-independent. Think, for example, of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which investigates large companies and corporate malfeasance. You wouldn't necessarily want the President of the United States to be able to go ahead and fire the head of the SEC if the SEC goes and investigates a company that the president likes. The Federal Communications Commission makes major decisions about the way that spectrum is handed out in this country. You wouldn't want the President of the United States to be able to pressure the FCC commissioner to decide to give some spectrum, which is very valuable, to one of the president's friends or colleagues, and threaten to fire them if they don't go along. So that's the reason that these agencies were created to be independent. It's unclear if the President of the United States, just by signing this executive order, can change that.
And Nancy, the president himself said, of the topics so far discussed today at his press conference, Ukraine was the biggest. And he offered this assessment describing his level of confidence about the first talks between the U.S. delegation and the Russians in Saudi Arabia. Let's listen.
Well, much more confident. They were very good. Russia wants to do something. They want to stop the savage barbarianism. I mean, what's going on over there? It's soldiers are being killed by the thousands on a weekly basis. It's ridiculous.
And Nancy, your ear was tuned to this, so was mine. Hard to find a single discouraging word from the President of the United States about Russia's culpability in the war in Ukraine.
Right. I mean, it's pretty clear who's responsible for the savage barbarianism, as he described it, and that is Russia, which invaded Ukraine 3 years ago unprovoked. And yet the President of the United States multiple times in this event and in so many others refused to simply acknowledge that Russia was the initial and only aggressor and that Ukraine has simply been fighting to retain its sovereignty. In fact, he lashed out at Ukraine far more than he did lash out at Russia in this Q&A. He said that if the president of Ukraine knew what he was doing, he would have negotiated an end to the war a long time ago. He wouldn't have allowed it to happen. Unclear how Ukraine could have prevented Russia from invading it. But you know, it's part of a pattern where the president has pretty harsh words for the country that was attacked, but very few, if any, harsh words for the country that attacked them. And you know, that's semantics, but the issue behind it and what has so many European allies concerned and what certainly has the Ukrainians concerned is the fact that this is a reflection of how President Trump plans to go into these negotiations that he says he wants to happen right away to end the war. The Ukrainians feel he's already putting his thumb on the scale for the Russians, and they worry about what that means for them.
And the president did raise some issues that many Americans who don't follow this day by day might be surprised about. So, well, they have martial law in Ukraine. That's true. It was imposed when the Russians invaded as a national security measure. And there is a presidential election scheduled for the spring suspended. Why? Because martial law precludes, under Ukrainian law, the conducting of a presidential election when your country has been invaded by another aggressor, which is what has happened. So those things are true, but they're not necessarily the fault of the Ukrainians. Again, the president seemed to imply that this either could have been averted by the Ukrainians or they're the ones principally to blame. And that has to feel very good for Vladimir Putin, not just as a matter of what a president does or doesn't choose to emphasize, but as a backdrop for any conversations about the future of resolving this conflict.
Right. I mean, the very fact, Major, that we got that tableau of the Secretary of State sitting in Saudi Arabia across the table from his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and we're told they met for about 4.5 hours. That is a scene that we have not witnessed in years because the Americans have, like so many other countries, basically cut off diplomatic engagement with Russia because of its invasion. And in this meeting today, not only did they say that they were going to continue talking on a bilateral basis, but the Secretary of State actually said that they want to increase their diplomatic cooperation and that they want the Russians to have more diplomats working in their embassy in Washington, D.C. They want to send more Americans to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. They want to increase economic cooperation with Russia, and that if all goes well in these negotiations, that they want to lift the crippling sanctions that have been placed on Russia since the start of the invasion. And, you know, it bears repeating how different this policy is from what we heard in the last administration and from what we're basically hearing from most U.S. allies around the world.
Now, Nancy, it's certainly possible that President Trump is softening up the rhetoric and maybe doing a head fake with the Russians and will drive a hard bargain on behalf of Ukrainian sovereignty, what's left of it after this invasion. All that is possible. Yep. I'm not ruling that out. But what you know and what I know is that the Russians care deeply about the way in which history, as they see it, is described. And when they hear an American president sort of basically describe it their way, they feel and this has been proven out in all sorts of other negotiations, the Russians drive a hard bargain. They always do. They look out for their interests aggressively, very aggressively. And in diplomatic encounters with presidents I've covered, they always want their side of the story established and agreed to, whether Americans agree with it or not. And when a president, like we've just seen, President Trump, more or less orients himself toward the Russian side of it, they feel, whether they've gained ground or not, that they have. And in that context, I want to play this soundbite about a question the president was asked about whether or not it's justifiable for Ukrainians to feel disappointed about the U.S. approach to these peace talks. Let's listen.
Today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
They chose, the Ukrainians. There we have it.
Hey, look, there are all kinds of ways to conduct a negotiation, right? To your point, Major, it could be that the Trump administration has a strategy where they're going into these negotiations saying, hey, Russia, you're going to get a great deal here. We're going to make sure it's really fair for you. And then they drive a hard bargain and say, but look, look at how well we've done for you. You should take this deal. I think the reason that many U.S. allies are concerned that that is not actually the strategy is because of what President Trump has said about Russia and about Vladimir Putin, not just over the past year or two, but really over the past 10 years, in which he has routinely downplayed Russia's flaws, Russia's foreign policy when it is not in the U.S. interest, and certainly in this case has focused on what he sees as Ukraine's culpability here. But there is a degree to which the Trump team is simply saying the quiet part out loud. Biden officials, though they felt it was not very helpful to say it publicly, they also believed that this invasion at the end of the day was only going to be wound down if there was some kind of negotiated settlement where the Ukrainians gave up some land. And so the Trump officials say, look, we're just saying what everybody already knows.
Nancy Cordes in West Palm Beach, thank you very, very much.